What would you do if the only thing your father left behind was a threadbare coat and a debt that could swallow the sky? If the land that held your entire life, every memory of your mother's garden, and every fence post your father drove into the hard dirt, was about to be signed away on a piece of paper in a warm office miles from your home? For Margaret Vale, this wasn't a question. It was the cold, hard morning of her 25th year in the Wyoming Territory. The banker had been polite, his words smooth as worn river stones, but their meaning was sharp. Foreclosure. The word hung in the air of the small cabin long after his buggy had disappeared down the dusty track, a bitter smoke she couldn't wave away. Her father, Thomas Vale, had been a quiet man, a man who spoke more to the seasons than to people, and he had died just as quietly, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any noise. He'd also left behind the claim, a piece of earth he'd loved with a fierce, unspoken passion, and the loan he'd taken against it, a weight she now had to carry alone. What happened next wasn't a miracle, but something quieter, something sewn into the very fabric of her loss. The truth was waiting, not in a bank vault or a lawyer's letter, but in the lining of an old winter coat, a secret stitched with faded thread. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we follow a trail of memory and ink into the heart of a stolen valley. Margaret spent the next day in a fog of grim purpose, sorting through the few possessions her father had deemed worthy of keeping. His tools, worn to the shape of his hands. A small collection of books with cracked spines. A tin box holding her mother's locket. And in the corner, draped over a wooden chair, was his winter coat. It was a poor thing, made of heavy wool the color of dust, its elbows patched with leather and its collar frayed. It smelled of pine smoke, horse, and the cold, clean air of the high country. It was the last thing he had worn. She ran her hand over the rough fabric, a gesture of farewell, and felt the familiar ache in her chest. She had nothing. Less than nothing. The bank would take the land, the cabin, everything. She would be just another soul cast adrift in the vast, indifferent territory. Her fingers brushed against a stiff, awkward seam inside the lining, just below the collar. It was clumsy work, not her mother's neat, invisible stitches. It was her father's hand, she knew it instantly. A repair made in haste. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, a need to touch something he had touched, she found her mother's sewing kit. With a small, sharp blade, she carefully unpicked the thick, uneven threads. They came away slowly, reluctantly, as if guarding their secret. Beneath the wool, not a patch, but a small, flat packet wrapped in oiled canvas. Her fingers, numb with cold and apprehension, fumbled with the knot. Inside was a piece of parchment, folded into a tight square. It was brittle with age, and when she unfolded it, it crackled in protest. It was a map, or more precisely, half of one. The ink was faded to a soft brown, the lines drawn with a steady, deliberate hand. It showed the curve of a river she didn't recognize, the sharp angles of foothills, and a peculiar symbol, a circle with a cross inside it, drawn next to a formation of rocks labeled only the Sisters. There were no names, no directions, just the stark, silent language of the land. It was her father's drafting style, the same precise lettering she'd seen on his sketches of the cabin. But it made no sense. It was a fragment, a piece of a larger puzzle leading from nowhere to nothing. She held it up to the lantern light, her breath misting in the cold air. A fool's map, a child's drawing. It was worthless, just another piece of a life that had ended in failure. Another scrap of forgotten hope. She nearly crumpled it, nearly tossed it into the cold hearth to burn with the kindling. It was a reminder of all he had lost, of the dreams that had turned to dust in his hands. But something stayed her. A memory, thin as a ghost, of her father sitting at this very table, his head bent over a piece of parchment, a look of intense, quiet concentration on his face. He'd looked up and seen her watching, and a rare, sad smile had touched his lips before he'd quickly folded the paper away. He had been hiding it. He had sewn it into the coat he wore every day, keeping it close to his heart. It wasn't worthless to him, and so it couldn't be worthless to her. She folded the map carefully, the paper whispering against her fingers, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. It was a sliver of a chance, a thread in a storm. It was all she had left. What was this map her father guarded so closely? Was it a path to a hidden treasure, or a map of a broken promise? Let us know in the comments what you think she should do, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. For Margaret Vale, the answer lay somewhere in the cold blue shadows of the foothills, and she was about to walk right into them. The next morning, Margaret rode into the small, dusty settlement of Providence. The town was little more than a single street flanked by false-fronted buildings, a place where whispers traveled faster than a horse's gallop. Her father's old mare, Juniper, a steady graying animal with wise eyes, moved with a familiar, placid gait. Her presence a small comfort in a world that felt increasingly hostile. Margaret's destination was the Mercantile, a place that served as the town's post office, supply depot, and hub of all gossip. The man behind the counter was Silas Croft, a portly man with a watch chain stretched tight across his vest and eyes that missed nothing. He was also the local agent for the very bank that held the note on her father's claim. He greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Come for supplies?" "Information," Margaret replied, her own voice quiet but firm. She unfolded the map fragment on the worn wooden counter. The chatter in the store died down as a few onlookers drifted closer. Croft picked up the parchment, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something distasteful. He squinted at it, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What's this, then? One of your father's little fantasies?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "A map to a gold mine that doesn't exist?" Thomas was always chasing shadows. The men leaning against the Cracker Barrel chuckled. Margaret's face burned, but she held her ground. "Do you recognize the landmarks?" Croft tossed the map back onto the counter. "It's nothing. A doodle. The sisters could be any of a dozen rock piles in those hills. You'd be wasting your time, girl. Better to spend it packing your things. The bank is patient, but not sentimental." His words were a clear threat, a public dismissal. He was branding her a fool, just as he had branded her father. As she turned to leave, her face set like stone. A hand gently touched her arm. It belonged to an old Shoshone woman who sometimes came to town to trade. Her face was a beautiful map of its own, etched with the lines of a long life. She was known only as Numa. Her dark eyes gazed not at Margaret, but at the parchment in her hand. "Some lines show where to go," the old woman said, her voice soft as dry leaves skittering on the wind. "Some show who to be." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing in a pool of sudden silence. The cryptic words settled in Margaret's mind, meaningless and yet heavy with significance. She didn't understand, but she felt the weight of a choice. Croft's mockery had been meant to break her, to make her accept her fate. Instead, it had ignited a spark of her father's stubbornness. She would not be dismissed. She would not let his memory be a joke in this town. She walked out of the mercantile, the half-map clutched in her hand, the laughter of the men still ringing in her ears. She would follow this trail of ink and memory, not for gold, but for an answer. She owed her father that much. That afternoon, she packed a small canvas roll with what little she had, a tin of coffee, a side of bacon, a handful of hard biscuits, and her father's bedroll. She saddled Juniper, whose soft nuzzle against her shoulder felt like a vote of confidence. The decision was made. The world saw a worthless piece of paper. Numa saw a path of character. Margaret only knew it was the one road left for her to take. The journey began under a vast, empty sky the color of faded denim. Margaret rode east, away from the familiar dirt track to Providence, and into the rolling, sage-dusted foothills that climbed toward the distant, jagged peaks of the Wind River Range. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the steady plod of Juniper's hooves. The land was beautiful and brutal, a place that made a person feel small and temporary. For 2 days, she followed the faint lines of a game trail, her eyes scanning the horizon, comparing the shapes of the ridges and outcrops to the brown ink on the parchment. It was a frustrating, almost hopeless task. The map was an abstraction, the land an overwhelming reality of stone, scrub, and sky. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. Croft's mocking voice echoed in her mind. Chasing shadows. Was he right? Was she honoring her father? Or simply repeating his mistakes, following a phantom promise into the wilderness? She made camp the second evening in the shelter of a small bluff, the wind whispering through the tall pines. Juniper stood nearby, her head low, occasionally flicking an ear toward the deepening darkness. The horse was her only anchor, a living link to the man who had raised them both. Margaret built a small fire, the flames pushing back the immense loneliness of the landscape. She stared into the embers, the map spread on her knee. She remembered her father's hands, calloused and stained with dirt, yet so gentle when he'd tended to a sick animal or shown her how to read the stars. He wasn't a fool. He was a dreamer, perhaps, but not a fool. There was a logic to him, a quiet sense of order. The map had to have that same logic. The third day dawned cold and clear. Margaret pushed onward, a quiet determination having settled over her during the night. Around noon, she rounded a bend in a dry wash and saw it. 2 towering spires of granite, weathered by millennia of wind and ice, stood side by side against the sky. They were unmistakable. The sisters. A jolt went through her, a mixture of triumph and terror. The map was real. She dismounted, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the rock formation, Juniper following at a respectful distance. Up close, the rocks were immense, their surfaces a tapestry of lichen and shadow. The map showed the symbol, the circle with a cross, on the eastern face of the southern spire. She walked around it, her hand trailing against the cool, rough stone. There was nothing. No carving, no marking, just natural rock. The hope that had flared within her moments before guttered and died, leaving a cold ash of disappointment. It was a coincidence. Just 2 rocks that happened to look like the ones on a dead man's drawing. She sank to the ground, the full weight of her hopeless situation crashing down on her. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley floor. It was over. She had failed. She would sleep here tonight and turn back in the morning, back to face the banker and the end of her world. As the last rays of sunlight bled across the landscape, Margaret sat with her back against the cold granite, watching the world turn to shades of purple and gray. The air grew sharp with the coming night. She was too tired, too defeated, to even build a fire. She pulled her father's coat tighter around her shoulders, seeking a comfort that wasn't there. Juniper shifted her weight nearby, a soft, sighing sound in the immense quiet. The mare's presence was a silent rebuke to her despair. The horse was patient, enduring. It was a quality her father had admired, and one Margaret felt she sorely lacked. She was about to close her eyes, to give in to the exhaustion, when a glint of light caught her eye. It wasn't the warm, golden light of the setting sun, but a sharper, more focused reflection, coming from the very rock face she had just inspected. She stood up, her curiosity stirring faintly through the fog of her disappointment. She walked back to the eastern face of the southern spire, her eyes tracing the path of the final sunbeam as it sliced through a notch in the opposite ridge. The beam landed on a small, almost flat section of the rock, illuminating what had been invisible in the full light of day. There, so faint it was little more than a scratch, was the symbol from the map. A circle with a cross inside it. It wasn't carved deeply into the rock, but etched with a fine, precise tool, designed to be seen only at this exact time of day, perhaps on a certain day of the year. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no coincidence. It was intentional, a secret meant only for someone who knew how and when to look. A surveyor's mark. Her father had been a surveyor's assistant in his youth, before he'd staked his claim. He knew the trade. He knew how to read the land, not just for its surface features, but for its hidden lines, its secret geometry. A flood of memories returned. Her father teaching her how to use a compass, how to measure distance by her own stride, how to understand the subtle shifts in terrain. He wasn't mapping a treasure. He was mapping the land itself. The lines on the parchment weren't just drawings of a river and some hills. They were bearings, sight lines. The map wasn't a picture. It was a set of instructions. A profound shift occurred within her. She was no longer a grieving daughter chasing a ghost. She was an apprentice picking up her master's tools. The disappointment washed away, replaced by a surge of fierce, focused energy. She took out the map, her hands no longer trembling. The next line on the fragment pointed northwest from the sisters, toward a low saddle between two hills. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that if she walked that line, she would find another mark. The night was no longer a threat, but a pause, a time to rest before the real work began. The secret of the valley wasn't buried in the ground, it was written on it. And her father had left her the key to read it. The next morning, Margaret began her work in earnest. She used her father's old compass, its brass casing warm in her palm, and sighted a line northwest from the marker on the sisters. She measured her paces as he had taught her, her stride even and consistent, her mind focused on the count. The land was rough, the terrain broken by ravines and thickets of thorny brush. It was slow, grueling labor. Juniper followed patiently, her bridle jingling softly, a four-legged shadow to Margaret's solitary progress. By midday, she found the second marker, another faint etching on a flat stone at the base of a gnarled juniper tree, exactly where the line on the map indicated it should be. The discovery sent a thrill of vindication through her. She was on the right path. For days, this became her rhythm. Rise at dawn, sight the next bearing, and walk the line. The work was physically demanding, but her mind was clear and sharp. With each marker she found, she felt a deeper connection to her father, as if she were walking in his very footsteps, seeing the land through his eyes. She was learning the grammar of his secret language. He had used the setting sun, the notches in the ridges, the very bones of the earth as his monuments. It was a survey of incredible precision and subtle artistry, hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, while tracking a line across a wide, grassy basin, she saw a rider approaching. He was tall in the saddle, his figure lean and straight. As he drew closer, she saw he was a rancher, his face weathered by the sun and wind, his eyes a pale, watchful blue. He rode a strong-looking buckskin and led a pack-horse. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to spook Juniper. "You're a long way from any place, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and carried a note of caution. "This is private range." "I'm just passing through," Margaret said, her hand resting on Juniper's neck. "You're not passing. You're walking a line," he observed, his gaze sharp. "I've been watching you for 2 days. You walk like a surveyor." Margaret felt a prickle of alarm. "Who are you?" "William Mercer," he replied. "This is my family's land, or what's left of it." He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He was guarded, but not hostile. "My father was a surveyor," Margaret offered, deciding a piece of the truth was better than a lie. "I'm following one of his old routes." She showed him the map fragment. William studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He traced the lines with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've seen these marks before," he said quietly, looking up at her. "Years ago. My father called them the ghost lines. He said they were from the original territorial survey, before the big ranchers and the railroad came through." He pointed to a symbol on her map. "That's an old Army Corps of Engineers mark. I was a scout for a time. I know their work." He looked from the map to her face, a new understanding in his eyes. "This isn't just an old route, is it? This is a boundary line." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. He understood. He saw what she saw. "I think so," she said. "But my map is incomplete." "Maybe I can help," William said. "The next point on that bearing should be near a spring at the base of that butte. My father showed it to me once." He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. He was a stranger, but he was the first person who hadn't laughed at her, who hadn't dismissed her quest. She saw in his face the same quiet stubbornness she felt in herself, the same deep connection to the land. She made her decision. "All right, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Show me." Together they rode toward the butte. William moved through the landscape with a quiet confidence that spoke of long familiarity. He pointed out landmarks, not by their official names, but by the names his family had given them over generations. He spoke of his father, who had lost most of his original homestead in a series of legal disputes with powerful cattle barons, men who had arrived with lawyers and documents that superseded his family's older claims. The bank that held Margaret's note was a silent partner in many of those outfits. As he spoke, the pieces began to click into place in Margaret's mind. This wasn't just about her father's secret. It was about something much larger. They found the spring just as William had predicted, a trickle of clear, cold water emerging from a fissure in the rock. And there, on a stone half buried in the damp earth, was the next marker. From there, the trail led them higher into a grove of ancient, wind-twisted pines. The final mark on Margaret's fragment pointed to a spot in the center of the grove. There was no rock, no tree, just a patch of earth that seemed slightly sunken. "This is it," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is the last point I have." William dismounted and began to probe the ground with the heel of his boot. "Feels hollow here," he muttered. He pulled a small spade from his pack horse and began to dig. The earth was soft and loamy. A few inches down, the spade hit something solid: wood. Working together, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the weathered gray planks of a small, collapsed roof. It was a line cabin, or what was left of one, a shelter for shepherds or trappers, long since abandoned and reclaimed by the earth. It had been deliberately buried. "Why would he lead me here?" Margaret wondered aloud. "He wasn't leading you to the cabin," William said, his eyes scanning the ruin. "He was leading you to what's inside it." Using the spade as a lever, they pried away the rotten timbers of the roof, revealing a small, dark space beneath. The air that rose from it was stale and smelled of dust and decay. Margaret lowered herself into the shallow pit. The floor was packed earth, save for one corner, where a single wide floorboard lay slightly askew. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knelt and worked her fingers into the gap, pulling it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dry dirt, was a rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavy, solid. William reached down and lifted it out into the sunlight. He carefully unwrapped the layers of stiff, cracking material. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the kind used by surveyors and engineers. Its cover was stamped with the seal of the U.S. Territorial Survey. Tied to it with a piece of twine was another folded piece of parchment. Margaret took it with trembling hands. She unfolded it. It was the other half of the map. When she placed the two pieces together, they formed a complete whole, a perfect survey of the entire valley, from the river to the high peaks. And inside the ledger, on the first page, was her father's elegant script. "The true and original boundary survey of the Sweetwater Valley," it read. "Thomas Vale, Assistant Surveyor. Witnessed by Elias Mercer." William stared at the second name. Elias Mercer was my grandfather. They opened the book. The pages were filled with her father's meticulous notes, with dates, coordinates, and detailed sketches of the landscape. It was a complete record of the valley's original survey, conducted 20 years earlier, before the land rush, before the powerful interests arrived. But tucked into the back of the ledger was a series of letters, written in her father's hand to his partner, a man named Franklin Henderson. The letters spoke of their shared work, of their duty to draw honest lines. Then the tone changed. The later letters were desperate, pleading. Her father accused Henderson of colluding with land speculators, of creating a second, fraudulent set of maps and deeds. He wrote of threats made against his family, of being forced off his own claim and into silence. The final entry was dated just a year before his death. "Henderson has sold his soul," he wrote. "He has taken my map, the other half of our work, and used it to legitimize the theft. They have stolen this entire valley. I am hiding my record, my half of the truth. I pray one day someone finds it and can make the lines straight again." It was all there. The proof. Silas Croft's employers, the cattle barons, the bank, their legal titles were built on a foundation of forgery and betrayal. William's family hadn't just lost their land in a legal dispute. They had been systematically robbed, along with dozens of others. Margaret finally understood. Her father hadn't been chasing a shadow. He had been guarding a truth so dangerous it had cost him everything. He wasn't mapping a treasure of gold. He was mapping a legacy of justice, a promise to the land and its rightful people. He had sewn one half into his coat and buried the other, creating a puzzle only someone who knew his mind and his methods could ever hope to solve. The weight of the discovery settled on them both. It was a truth that could restore a community, but it was also a truth that powerful men would do anything to keep buried. As if on cue, the sky, which had been clear and blue, began to darken with an unnatural speed. A low moan of wind swept through the pines. A storm was coming, a fierce, early blizzard blowing down from the high peaks. They were exposed, isolated, and holding a book that could get them killed. The shelter of the ruined cabin was not enough. They needed to find better cover, and fast. The first snowflakes, hard and stinging, began to fall as they scrambled to pack their horses. The wind rose to a howl, and the world dissolved into a blinding chaos of white. They were trapped. The blizzard descended with a terrifying fury, wiping out the world in a swirling vortex of snow and wind. Visibility dropped to near zero. William, relying on instinct and a scout's knowledge of the terrain, led them down from the high grove toward a rocky overhang he knew of, a shallow cave that offered some protection from the storm's onslaught. They huddled in the back of the small shelter, the horses standing close for warmth, their coats already white with snow. The ledger, wrapped again in its oilcloth, was tucked safely in Margaret's saddlebag. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that seeped into their bones. They shared the last of Margaret's coffee, sipping the hot, bitter liquid from a single tin cup, their hands shaking. The storm was their immediate crisis, a battle for survival against the elements. But as the hours passed, another threat emerged. Through a brief lull in the wind, they heard the faint sound of voices, men shouting to one another. Two riders appeared out of the white gloom, their figures hunched against the wind. They were Croft's men, sent from Providence to find her, to stop her. They hadn't seen the small cave yet, but they were close, their search pattern bringing them directly toward the overhang. William drew his pistol, his face grim. But before he could act, another sound cut through the storm's howl, a child's cry. Out of the blizzard stumbled a man and a woman, pulling a small handcart that held two young children, their faces blue with cold. They were settlers, a family whose wagon had broken down, caught in the storm while trying to cross the pass. The man, whose name was David, looked at Margaret and William with desperate eyes. "Please," he begged, "our children. They won't last much longer out here." At that moment, Croft's men spotted them. They drew their rifles, their intentions clear. The choice was instant and absolute. This was the test. It was no longer just about a book or a piece of land. Margaret looked at the terrified family, then at the ledger in her bag. She met William's gaze, and he saw the same resolve in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. He gave a sharp nod. They were no longer just two individuals. They were protectors. While William positioned himself at the mouth of the cave, laying down suppressing fire that sent Croft's men scrambling for cover, Margaret helped the family into the small shelter. She wrapped the children in her own bedroll, rubbing their frozen hands and feet. She gave the mother, Sarah, the last of their food. She acted with a calm, steady competence that surprised even herself. She was her father's daughter, a person who did what needed to be done. The standoff lasted for hours. The storm was their unlikely ally, its ferocity making a direct assault on the cave impossible. Croft's men were pinned down, unable to risk a charge in the deep, drifting snow. Eventually, as darkness fell and the blizzard reached its peak, they gave up, their shouted curses swallowed by the wind. They retreated, vowing to return. Inside the cave, the small group huddled together, sharing body heat against the brutal cold. David and Sarah, their children now sleeping fitfully, looked at Margaret with a gratitude that needed no words. She had chosen to shelter them, to risk everything for strangers. In that small, frozen cave, in the heart of a deadly storm, a new kind of community was forged, bound not by law or land, but by a shared act of courage and compassion. The blizzard had been a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. And Margaret Vale had not been found wanting. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The air was achingly cold and bright. Croft's men were long gone. After making sure the settler family was safe and had a fire going, Margaret and William saddled their horses. The ledger felt heavier than ever, not with its physical weight, but with the weight of responsibility. They rode back to Providence, the journey slow and difficult through the deep snow. When they arrived, the town was stirring, digging itself out. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. The sight of Margaret Vale, whom Silas Croft had loudly declared lost to the storm, riding in alongside the quiet and respected William Mercer, sent a ripple of murmurs through the street. They went directly to the Territorial Land Office, a small, cramped room smelling of paper and stove smoke. The clerk was a young man from the East named Elias Thorne, known for his fastidious nature and his unwavering adherence to the rules. He was the kind professional, the man who dealt not in rumor but in fact. Silas Croft was already there, loudly recounting his concern for Miss Vale's safety. When he saw her, his face paled. Margaret ignored him. She placed the leather-bound ledger on the counter in front of Thorne. "I believe this is the original survey of the Sweetwater Valley," she said, her voice clear and steady. Thorne opened the book, his brow furrowed in skepticism. He began to read. William stood beside Margaret, his presence a silent statement of support. A crowd began to gather at the door, drawn by the unfolding drama. The family Margaret and William had rescued, the Davids, had made it to town, and their story had already spread. The story of the 2 riders who had appeared in the blizzard, of the woman who had given her own blanket to save their children. Thorne spent nearly an hour poring over the ledger, comparing its entries to the official plat maps hanging on the wall. The silence in the room was absolute. He traced the lines with his finger. He checked the dates. He examined the seal. Finally, he looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional excitement. "The discrepancies are undeniable," he announced to the quiet room. "The official deeds on file are based on forged survey points. This book, this is the true record. It's all here. The original boundaries, the witness signatures." He looked at Margaret with a newfound respect. "Where did you find this?" "My father left it for me," she said simply. At that moment, the townspeople in the doorway began to murmur. Old grievances, long-buried stories of lost claims and unfair deals surfaced. Many of them were the children and grandchildren of the homesteaders who had been cheated. The town's chorus of mockery had transformed into a chorus of reverence. They looked at Margaret not as a fool chasing shadows, but as the keeper of a sacred trust. Silas Croft stood frozen, his face ashen. He wasn't threatened with violence or arrested. He was simply rendered irrelevant, his power dissolved by the quiet authority of a truth written in faded ink. The vindication was not loud or explosive. It was a deep, quiet shifting of the foundations of the entire valley. The lines were finally being made straight. In the weeks that followed, the valley was quietly remade. Lawyers and judges descended on Providence, and with the irrefutable evidence of Thomas Vale's ledger, the fraudulent deeds were systematically overturned. The land was being restored to the families of its original homesteaders, including the full measure of the Mercer Ranch. The balance of power had shifted, not through force, but through the patient, stubborn courage of one woman. Margaret's own claim was secured, the bank's foreclosure notice withdrawn and replaced with a letter of apology. The land was hers, free and clear, just as her father had always intended. One evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden light across the valley, Margaret stood on the small porch of her cabin. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. She had spent the day mending the very fence her father had built, her hands now calloused like his had been. William Mercer rode up, dismounting by the porch steps. He didn't come as a stranger anymore, but as a friend, a partner in the quiet revolution they had started. He handed her a small, freshly baked loaf of bread from his family's kitchen. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light paint the distant peaks in hues of rose and violet. The world felt peaceful, settled. "The Davids are staying," William said. "They're taking up a claim down by the river, the one that was stolen from your father's friend." "Good," Margaret murmured. "This valley needs more families like them." "It needs more people like you," William corrected her gently. He looked out at the vast expanse of land, now breathing with a new sense of justice. "All this time," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder, "we thought your father was a failed prospector. We thought he was looking for gold." Margaret smiled, a slow, sad smile of deep understanding. She thought of the faded ink, the hidden markers, the coat that had held the key. She finally understood the full measure of the man he was and the legacy he had left her. It wasn't about wealth, or land, or even revenge. It was about the integrity of a line drawn in the dirt, the sanctity of a promise made between a man and the earth he worked. She looked at the horizon, at the land that was now truly hers, and gave voice to the story's moral, the quiet apotheosis of her long journey. "He wasn't mapping a treasure," she said. "He was mapping a promise. We want to thank you for joining us for this story to the very end. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't things we can hold, but truths we can live by." If you were moved by Margaret's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of the Forgotten West. We'll see you next time. She was 19 and owned nothing but the clothes on her back, a canvas sack of tools, and the $58 her stepmother had pressed into her hand. With that money, she bought a worthless patch of desert in a place called Dry Fork, a claim abandoned decades ago. But what nobody knew, what the land agent didn't mention, was that the desert had swallowed a whole locomotive there, and locked inside its cab was a secret that would change her life forever. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Adeline Burke and the engine in the sand. Adeline's father had been a watchmaker, a man who believed the world was a series of intricate, interlocking movements, and that a person's worth was measured in their patience and the steadiness of their hands. He had taught her to see the beauty in a well-seated gear and the integrity of a true line. He died of a fever when she was 12, and the world he had so carefully assembled for her fell silent. Her stepmother, Eleanor, a woman who had married for security and found only the modest inheritance of a tradesman, saw Adeline not as a daughter, but as a ledger entry that refused to balance. Eleanor valued smooth surfaces and quiet rooms, and Adeline, with her grease-stained fingers and thoughtful silences, was a disruption. The true center of Adeline's world had been Silas Croft, the retired railroad engineer who lived next door. He was a widower, with hands as broad and calloused as iron plates, and he saw in Adeline the same love for machinery that had governed his own life. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Silas was teaching Adeline the anatomy of a steam engine, He taught her the difference between the hiss of a healthy boiler and the whisper of a leaking valve. He taught her how to true a piston rod, how to pack a gland, how to read the language of soot and steam. His workshop was a sanctuary of ordered metal, smelling of coal smoke, hot oil, and the sweet, sharp scent of grinding steel. He never spoke down to her, never treated her curiosity as a childish phase. He spoke to her as a peer, an apprentice in a sacred craft. For her 16th birthday, he gave her a box wrench, forged by his own hands. It was not a store-bought tool. It was perfectly balanced, the steel tempered to a deep, blue-black, with her initial, O, stamped into the head. "A good tool feels like part of your own hand," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "It doesn't fight you. It knows the work." Silas passed 2 years later, a quiet departure in his sleep, and with him went the last of Adeline's anchors. She kept the wrench wrapped in an oilcloth, a tangible piece of the only person who had ever truly seen her. The day Adeline turned 19, Eleanor called her into the parlor. The room was already barer than usual, the good china packed away in wooden crates. Eleanor sat in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished stone. She did not ask Adeline to sit. "The house is sold," she said, her voice even and without inflection. "The papers were signed this morning. I will be moving to my sister's, in the city." There was no room for discussion. It was a statement of fact, an administrative decree. Adeline stood by the door, her hands loose at her sides, and simply nodded. She felt no shock, only the dull, heavy certainty of something long expected, finally arriving. Eleanor gestured to a small envelope on the mantelpiece. "Your father left a small provision for you. After settling his debts and the cost of the sale, this is what remains. It is $58. The amount was an insult, a pittance, scraped from the sale of a lifetime of her father's careful work. But Adeline knew better than to argue. Arguing with Eleanor was like arguing with a closed door. She took the envelope without a word. "You will need to be gone by morning," Eleanor added, her gaze fixed on a point just past Adeline's shoulder. Adeline went to her small room and began to pack. She did not weep. Tears were a currency Eleanor did not trade in. She folded the few sets of clothes she owned, sturdy trousers and shirts, most of them her father's, which she had painstakingly re-sewn to fit her own slender frame. She gathered her tools, laying them carefully on a square of canvas: calipers, files, a set of smaller wrenches, and a heavy ball-peen hammer. Finally, she unwrapped Silas's box wrench, its dark steel cool and solid in her palm. She placed it in the very center of the roll. She had a small rucksack and the canvas tool roll. That was all. She slept on the floor that night, her bed already dismantled and sold. In the morning, the house was silent. Eleanor was gone. Adeline walked out the front door and did not look back. The $58, a small, stiff rectangle in her pocket. It was not an ending. It was a pressure, a force, compelling her forward into a life that was now entirely her own. The journey west was a lesson in dust and distance. Adeline bought a ticket for the train, the cheapest seat in the last car, and for 3 days she watched the world transform through the grimy window. The rolling green hills of her home flattened into plains. The trees grew sparse and huddled close to unseen water, and the sky grew vast and pale. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails was a familiar comfort, a language Silas had taught her to understand. She could hear the labor of the engine, the steady chuff of the pistons, the metallic sigh of the brakes. At night, she did not sleep in her seat, but curled up on the floor between the benches, her tool roll a pillow beneath her head, preferring the solid vibration of the floorboards to the swaying uncertainty of the carriage. She ate sparingly, making the bread and dried apples she had bought last, and she spoke to no one. Her silence was a shield, a way of holding herself intact against the press of the world. At the end of the line, she found a freight wagon heading further into the territory, paying the driver $2 to ride atop a load of crated goods. The transition from the iron certainty of the rails to the lurching, swaying progress of the wagon was jarring. Here, the world was no longer a blur, framed by a window, but an immediate, sensory press. The sun was a physical weight, relentless and white-hot. The air was thin, and carried the scent of dust, creosote, and something ancient and dry. The driver, a man named Henderson, with a face like cracked leather, pointed out landmarks, with a flick of his chin. "That's the Salt Flat," he'd grunted, gesturing to a shimmering expanse of white. "Nothing lives there." Adeline looked, and saw not emptiness, but a landscape of subtle gradations, of light and shadow, of a beauty so stark, it was almost painful. She saw the way the wind carved patterns in the sand, and the way a lone, twisted juniper clung to a rocky outcrop, a testament to a fierce and stubborn life. She learned the rhythms of the desert, the cool clarity of the mornings, the crushing heat of midday, and the profound, star-drenched silence of the nights. When they finally rolled into the outpost of Dry Fork, it felt less like an arrival and more like a surrender to the scale of the land. Dry Fork was little more than a dozen wooden buildings bleached to the color of bone, all huddled together as if for comfort against the immense, empty landscape. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a small office with a faded sign that read, "Territorial Land and Claim." Adeline walked into the office, the bell above the door jangling weakly. The agent was a thin man with a green eyeshade, hunched over a large, curling map pinned to the wall. He looked up, his expression a mixture of boredom and surprise. "Help you?" he asked. Adeline placed her hands on the counter. "I'm looking to buy a claim." He gestured to the map, which was dotted with small, square parcels, most of them marked with an X in pencil. "Not much left that's worth having," he said. "The good water claims are all took." Adeline's eyes scanned the map, moving past the desirable plots near the creek bed and out toward the edges, where the land was marked as arid and rocky. Her finger stopped on a small, unmarked square several miles from town. "What about this one?" The agent squinted. "Ah, that's the buried engine claim. Been on the books for 20 years. Nobody's ever wanted it." He explained that a flash flood, back in the 70s, had washed out a spur line, burying a locomotive and its tender under a mountain of sand and rock. The railroad company had written it off as a total loss, and the land had reverted to the territory. "It's yours for the filing fee," the agent said with a shrug. $15. "But I'm telling you, miss, there's nothing out there but sand and scrap." To him, scrap was worthless. To Adeline, who had learned from Silas that nothing made of good steel was ever truly worthless, it sounded like a promise. "I'll take it," she said, and counted out the $15. She walked the 3 miles out of town, following the agent's crude map. The sun was high and hot. Finally, she saw it. It wasn't just a pile of scrap. It was a monument. The sand had drifted up against it like a great wave, burying it to the top of its boiler. Only the smokestack, the steam dome, and the top of the cab were visible, jutting from the dune like the bones of some great, extinct beast. It was a Mogul, a 260, she recognized instantly, a powerful freight hauler. The visible steel was scoured by wind and sand, the paint long gone, replaced by a deep, uniform coat of rust that glowed orange in the afternoon sun. The glass in the cab windows was shattered, but the iron body, the great, solid mass of it, seemed intact, a thing of immense and patient strength. Adeline walked around the perimeter of her new property, her boots sinking into the soft sand. She laid a hand on the hot steel of the smokestack. It was real. It was hers. She felt a profound sense of rightness, a feeling of having arrived at the one place in the world that was waiting for her. The work was a kind of prayer, a conversation with the desert, carried out in the language of shovel and steel. Adeline began at dawn each day, before the sun had baked the air to a shimmer, and worked until the heat forced her to seek the sliver of shade cast by the buried engine. She had bought a sturdy shovel and a pickaxe in town, and her first task was to uncover the cab. The sand was heavy and dense, packed hard by years of wind and weather, and each shovelful was a victory. Her hands, already calloused from her time with Silas, blistered and then hardened into tough leather. Sweat slicked her hair to her forehead and stung her eyes, and the silence was broken only by the scrape of her shovel and her own steady breathing. Days bled into one another, measured not by a clock, but by the slow, incremental revealing of the locomotive. First, the roof of the cab emerged, then the tops of the windows, and finally, the running board and the high, spoked driving wheels. She was not just moving sand, she was excavating a history, peeling back the layers of time that had entombed this magnificent machine. After a week of relentless labor, the entire right side of the cab was free. The door, however, was jammed shut, its iron hinges fused by rust, the frame warped by the pressure of the earth. She spent a full day working on it, dripping precious oil into the seams, tapping at the hinges with her hammer, trying to coax the frozen metal into movement. Finally, she brought out Silas's wrench. She fitted it over the large bolt on the lower hinge, a bolt no other tool she had could grip. She wrapped a cloth around the handle for leverage, set her feet, and pulled. The metal groaned, a deep, protesting shriek that vibrated through the wrench and up her arms. She pulled again, putting her entire body into the effort, her muscles screaming. With a sudden, sharp crack, the rust gave way. The door shuddered open a few inches, releasing a puff of dry, ancient air. She used a crowbar to pry it the rest of the way. The interior was a solid wall of sand that had poured in through the broken windows. It took her another 2 days to empty it, bucket by bucket, until she could finally stand inside the cramped iron space. The engineer's seat, its leather upholstery cracked and faded, was still bolted to the floor. The gauges on the backhead were shattered, their needles frozen in time. As she was clearing the last of the debris from the firebox, her fingers brushed against something that was not brick or sand. It was a small, steel box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, welded shut and tucked deep into a corner. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She worked at it carefully, using a cold chisel and her hammer to break the welds. The lid finally came free. Inside, nestled in a bed of dry cloth, was a stack of banknotes, a small leather-bound journal, and a single, perfectly smooth, gray and white agate. She sat back on her heels, the desert sun streaming through the cab window, and opened the journal. The first page was not a log entry, but a letter, the handwriting a neat, steady cursive. My name is Elias Vance. I was the engineer of this engine, number 47. If you are reading this, then the flood got the better of me, and the railroad has given us up for lost. We were caught in a flash flood in a narrow canyon, and the track washed out from under us. The water pushed us here before the sand came and buried us. Inside this box is my life savings, $370. It is not a fortune, but it is an honest sum earned over 20 years on the rails. There is also a journal of my runs, and an agate my daughter gave me for luck. She was taken by the fever when she was 6. I have no other family to leave this to. If you have found it, it is because you have worked for it. Use it to build something good. Do not let the desert have the last word. Adeline closed the journal, her fingers tracing the name Elias Vance. She looked at the money, the tangible result of a man's life of labor. She picked up the agate, its surface cool and smooth against her palm. In the silence of the cab, surrounded by the great, sleeping machine, she felt a profound connection to this stranger, this fellow traveler who had left a map for the future in the heart of his engine. The $370 felt heavier than gold in her pocket. It was not just money. It was a trust, a responsibility passed from one pair of working hands to another. Adeline walked back into Dry Fork, no longer a transient with a foolish notion, but a woman with capital and a plan. Her first purchase was a proper canvas tent, thick and waterproof, and a small wood stove that could ward off the surprising chill of the desert nights. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and coffee, a new set of work gloves, and 2 large barrels for water. She now had the means not just to survive, but to establish a real foothold. Her quiet, relentless work on the engine had not gone unnoticed. A young man named Caleb, who made his living hauling water from the deep well east of town, began to make the trip out to her claim. The first time, he simply left a full barrel near her campsite without a word. Adeline found him in town the next day and paid him for the water and for the next month's deliveries. A silent agreement was struck. Every Tuesday morning, Caleb's wagon would appear on the horizon, and he would exchange her empty barrel for a full one, sometimes leaving a small parcel from the general store, a newspaper, or a piece of salted meat, a quiet gesture of connection. The town blacksmith, Jedediah Croft, a man in his 60s with a wild gray beard and arms corded with muscle, eventually rode his horse out to see the engine for himself. He circled the excavated locomotive, his expert eye taking in the state of the boiler, the frame, the driving rods. He looked at the work Adeline had done. The neat piles of sand, the carefully organized salvageable parts. He looked at her hands. "You know your way around steel," he said. It was the highest compliment he could give. Adeline told him about her plans to salvage the boiler plates and the brass fittings. "You'll need a hotter forge than you can manage in a campfire," he said, "and tools you don't have." He made her an offer. She could use his forge in the evenings, after his own work was done, and he would help her craft the specialized cutters and pullers she needed. In return, she would give him a share of the high-quality steel she recovered. They shook on it, their hands calloused and capable, sealing a partnership built on mutual respect for the craft. Marta, the woman who ran the general store, began to greet Adeline by name, extending her a line of credit without being asked. "Pay me when you can," she said, her smile warm. "A woman working that hard deserves a bit of trust." The community was not built with declarations, but with these small, practical acts of support. It was a chain of work and worth, each person contributing their skill, water, iron, credit, food, and in doing so, they were helping Adeline rebuild, not just a machine, but a life. Slowly, Adeline's claim transformed from a desolate patch of sand into a place of purpose. The locomotive, once a tomb, became the heart of her world. It was her workshop, her quarry, and her fortress against the wind. People in Dry Fork no longer called it the buried engine claim. They called it Addie's engine. It had become a landmark, a testament to her singular vision and tireless labor. With Jedediah's help, she had learned to cut rivets and free the heavy sheets of boilerplate. She salvaged brass valves, copper piping, and cast iron fittings, all of which had value. She traded the raw materials with Jedediah for finished goods, sturdy hinges and latches for a permanent shelter, a custom-made set of tools, and even a small, efficient cook stove forged from the very steel she had recovered. Using salvaged railroad ties for a foundation and heavy timbers for the frame, she built a small, one-room shack nestled in the protective lee of the engine's massive boiler. The walls were made of plate steel, riveted together, and the roof was fashioned from the curved top of the tender. It was not a pretty home, but it was solid, weatherproof, and entirely her own. Inside, it was a space of simple order. A cot stood in one corner, a small table and chair in another. Her tools were hung in neat rows on the wall, and the small stove radiated a steady warmth against the cold desert nights. Her days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for the hard, physical work of salvage. Afternoons were for sorting and cleaning her finds, or for reading from Elias Vance's journal. She read his accounts of hauling freight through mountain passes in winter, of battling snowdrifts and frozen switches, and of the simple pleasure of a hot meal at the end of a long run. He wrote about his daughter, about the small, smooth stone she had found in a riverbed and given to him. Through his plain, honest words, he became a living presence, a silent mentor, sharing the wisdom of his years. In the evenings, she would often walk into town to work at Jedediah's forge, the ringing of her hammer on steel, a familiar song in the quiet streets of Dry Fork. She was no longer an outsider. She was a fixture, a part of the town's small, interlocking community. She was Adeline Burke, the girl who was digging up a train, the woman who could make dead iron useful again. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in strokes of deep orange and violet, the colors bleeding into the vast, dusty blue above. Adeline sat on the heavy steel running board of the mogul, the metal still holding the day's warmth. The desert air was cooling rapidly, carrying the clean, sharp scent of sage and dry earth. Behind her, a warm yellow light glowed from the single window of the small, sturdy shack she had built, a beacon of her own making in the immense twilight. The locomotive was fully excavated now, a great, dark leviathan resting in a crater of sand, its rust-colored flanks looking less like decay and more like the hide of some ancient, patient creature. She had finished her work for the day and was performing the final ritual, cleaning her tools. She wiped each one with an oiled rag, feeling the familiar weight and balance, checking the edges and surfaces for wear. This was a habit Silas had instilled in her, a sign of respect for the tools and for the work they enabled. She took up the custom-made box wrench, his gift, and ran her thumb over the small, stamped A. It felt like an extension of her own hand, a conduit for the knowledge and care he had passed down to her. She set it carefully on the running board beside her. From her pocket, she took out the small, smooth agate left by Elias Vance. She rolled it between her palms, its polished surface a cool, comforting weight. Two objects from two good men, strangers to each other, both of whom had lived by the integrity of their work. Silas had taught her how to build. Elias had given her the means to begin. She thought of Eleanor, her stepmother, not with the sharp edge of anger anymore, but with a quiet, distant sorrow. Eleanor had looked at Adeline's father's life, at his workshop full of intricate tools and half-finished timepieces, and had seen only assets to be liquidated. She had looked at Adeline and seen only a liability. She could never have understood that the truest inheritance wasn't money, but skill, not a house, but the knowledge of how to build one. Adeline Burke was 19 years old and had been cast out with $58 to her name. She had spent 15 of it on a piece of land everyone said was worthless, a claim defined by a wreck. It was the best $15 she had ever spent. She had found a home, not in a house, but in a purpose. The desert had not taken the locomotive. It had merely been keeping it safe for her. The silence of the vast landscape was no longer a sign of emptiness, but of peace. She had learned to listen to it, to understand its subtle language. She had taken what was abandoned and given it new life, and in doing so, had forged a new life for herself. The engine, the shack, the tools, the quiet respect of her neighbors. This was her inheritance, earned with her own two hands. It was more than enough. Thank you for joining us for Adeline's story. If her journey of resilience and reclamation moved you, consider subscribing and sharing this story with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of the human spirit. We leave you with this thought. What have you found of value in a place others have overlooked? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you again next time.